For 12 years, my billionaire mother built massive charities in my brother's name while I swallowed my grief. Then one rainy afternoon, I saw his custom silver necklace on a homeless man. I grabbed him and demanded to know where he got it. He looked at me with terrified eyes and whispered that he got it from my brother. My name is Harrison. I am 62 years old, and I spent 40 hard years managing a fleet of freight trucks right here in Chicago. I am a man who built his life on sweat, diesel fumes, and keeping my word. I always thought my hardest days were firmly in the rearview mirror. I thought I had earned a quiet retirement after decades of grinding out a living to support my family. But a rainy Tuesday afternoon on the South Side changed my entire reality, tearing open a wound I thought had scarred over a decade ago. 12 years ago, my billionaire mother Evelyn buried my younger brother Samuel. The police told us it was a horrific car fire on a lonely stretch of highway. They said the heat was so intense that there was barely anything left. We had a closed casket funeral. I remember standing there in the biting wind, wearing my best dark suit, crying for the boy I had protected since we were kids. Evelyn did not cry. My mother stood there like a statue carved out of ice. Within weeks, she used Samuel's death to launch a massive, high-profile charity foundation in his name. She raised millions. She rubbed elbows with politicians and celebrities, playing the tragic, grieving mother perfectly for the cameras. I stayed away from all that. I kept to my freight yard, swallowed my grief, and tried to honor my brother's memory in my own quiet way. I never asked her for a dime of her fortune, and she never offered. We lived in two completely different worlds. But then came that Tuesday. It was pouring rain, the kind of cold Chicago rain that sinks straight into your bones. I had just finished having a cheap cup of diner coffee and was walking past a soup kitchen on the South Side to get back to my truck. People were huddled under awnings trying to stay dry. That is when I saw him. A homeless man shivering in a ragged green jacket. But it was not his clothes that caught my eye. It was what hung around his neck, a heavy custom-made silver cross. It was Samuel's cross. I felt all the air leave my lungs. Our grandfather had that cross specially cast for Samuel when he turned 18. It had a very specific flaw, a small dent on the left arm where Samuel had dropped it on a concrete floor during a basketball game. He never took it off. Never. They told us it had melted in the fire. They told me there was nothing left to recover. I did not wait. I did not wonder if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I crossed that wet pavement in 3 long strides, grabbed the man by the collar of his wet jacket, and pinned him hard against the rough brick wall of the alley. I am an old man, but 40 years of hauling freight gives you a certain kind of strength, especially when your blood is boiling. I slammed him against the brick, ignoring the cold rain running down my face. "Where did you get this?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a rage I had buried for 12 years. The man was terrified. His eyes went wide, and he put his trembling hands up in defense. "Please, mister, please do not hurt me," he stammered. I tightened my grip, pulling him an inch off the wet ground. "I will ask you one more time. Where did you get this silver cross?" He swallowed hard and whispered the words that stopped my heart. "From your brother. Samuel gave it to me." I dropped him. He slid down the brick wall, coughing and rubbing his neck. I stood over him, the rain soaking through my clothes, feeling a cold numbness spread through my veins. "My brother has been dead for 12 years, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He died in a car fire. Do not lie to me. If you stole this, if you robbed a grave, I swear to God you will regret it." The man shook his head violently. He told me his name was Ray. He said he used to be a bookkeeper before his life fell apart, before the streets took him. I am not lying. I swear, Ray pleaded, wiping the rain from his face. 3 months ago I was sick, real sick. They put me in this squalid, run-down hospice facility outside the city. It was a dumping ground for people nobody cared about. I shared a room with a man. He was heavily sedated. They kept him pumped full of drugs day and night. He barely knew his own name most of the time. I listened paralyzed as the traffic splashed through the puddles behind me. Ray looked at the silver cross resting on his chest and then looked back up at me. "One night, the nurses forgot his medication," Ray said. Just for a few hours, the fog lifted from his brain. He started crying. He took this necklace off, forced it into my hand, and grabbed my arm with surprising strength. He begged me. He said his name was Samuel. He told me to find a man named Harrison who worked the freight yards in Chicago. He told me to tell Harrison that he was still alive. Then the orderlies came back, saw he was awake, and shot him up with another dose. He went right back to being a vegetable. Ray's hands were shaking as he spoke. "They kicked me out of the facility a week later when my state funding ran out. I have been looking for you around the freight yards, but nobody would listen to a homeless guy. I wore the cross, hoping you might see it." I stared at the silver cross, the dent on the left arm. It was undeniable. I felt an earthquake tearing through the very foundation of my life. My brother did not die in that car crash. The closed casket, the rushed funeral, Evelyn refusing to let me see the body, claiming it would be too traumatic. She had buried an empty box, or worse, she had buried a stranger. She had locked her own flesh and blood in a chemical prison, a dumping ground for the forgotten, and then built a glowing public image on the back of his fake grave. For 12 years, I had mourned a man who was sitting in a drug-induced fog begging for his big brother to save him. A normal person might have gone to the police. But I am not naive. I am a black man in my 60s holding a story told by a homeless man about one of the richest, most powerful white-collar women in Illinois. The police would laugh me out of the precinct. Evelyn had judges and politicians eating out of her hand. She donated millions to police benevolent funds. If I filed a report, the paperwork would mysteriously disappear, and by morning Samuel would be moved to an even deeper, darker hole, or he would quietly suffer a real fatal heart attack. I did not have proof for the law, but I had proof for my soul. I gave Ray all the cash I had in my wallet, told him to stay out of sight, and ran back to my truck. I climbed into the cab, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I turned the key, the heavy diesel engine roaring to life. I did not drive to my quiet home. I drove my heavy-duty truck straight up the highway toward Lake Forest, where the mansions hide behind wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. The drive took an hour, but to me it felt like a lifetime. Every mile that passed, the grief inside me burned away, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated fury. I thought about the tears I had shed. I thought about how Evelyn would look at me with pity during the holidays, knowing exactly what she had done. I thought about those massive charity galas where she plastered my brother's smiling face on giant banners to extract millions of dollars from wealthy donors. The sheer sociopathic evil of locking her own child in a rural asylum just to build a financial empire on his supposed grave made my chest tighten like a rusted vice. I reached the massive iron gates of her estate. The security guard stepped out of his booth, holding his hand up to stop my muddy, battered truck. I did not slow down. I blasted the heavy air horn, swerved onto the perfectly manicured grass, bypassed the guard shack completely, and slammed the brakes right in front of her grand marble-columned entrance. The tires tore deep, ugly trenches into her pristine lawn. I kicked the door open and marched up the stone steps. I threw open the heavy oak doors of the mansion. The housekeeper screamed and dropped a vase, but I marched straight past her. I knew exactly where Evelyn would be. I walked down the long, quiet hallway lined with expensive paintings and pushed open the doors to her private study. Evelyn was sitting behind her massive mahogany desk. She was sipping tea, reviewing some charity documents. She looked up, annoyed by the sudden interruption. Her face was perfectly composed, framed by an expensive pearl necklace and tailored silk. She looked like the very picture of upper-class grace. I did not say a word at first. I walked right up to that desk, reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy silver cross I had just bought back from Ray, and slammed it down onto the polished mahogany wood. The metal struck the desk with a sharp, heavy crack that echoed through the quiet room. I leaned over the desk, planting my large, calloused hands on the surface, bringing my face close to hers. "Samuel gave that to a man in a hospice ward 3 months ago," I said, my voice vibrating with a dark, dangerous energy. "He told him to find Harrison. He told him to tell me he is alive." I expected her to gasp. I expected her to turn pale, to faint, to try and act shocked or pretend it was a miracle. I expected the reaction of a mother who had just been told her dead son was actually alive. Instead, the mourning mother facade vanished in a fraction of a second. The elegant, philanthropic billionaire disappeared. Her eyes turned completely cold-dead and calculating. She looked at the silver cross, then looked up at me with an expression of sheer icy indifference. She did not ask how he was. She did not ask where he was. Without breaking eye contact, her manicured hand slid slowly under the edge of the mahogany desk. I heard a very faint, almost imperceptible click. She had just pressed a silent panic button to call her private security team. The war had just begun. The moment my hand left the mahogany desk, 2 massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of Evelyn's study. They did not ask me to leave. They grabbed my arms with the kind of practiced, brutal force that told me my mother had used them to throw out trash before. I fought back. I have 40 years of heavy lifting in my bones, and my hands are like worn leather. But I am 62 years old, and these were professionals. They dragged me through the grand hallways of my childhood home. Evelyn did not even stand up from her leather chair. She just sat there, sipping her tea, and watched me go with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. They tossed me down the front stone steps onto the wet driveway like I was nothing. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets, soaking right through my jacket. I picked myself up, wiping the mud from my clothes, and walked miles to the nearest train station. I thought the worst was over. I thought the confrontation was the climax of the nightmare. I was completely wrong. The real nightmare started the next morning. I woke up early in my apartment on the South Side, ready to hire the best private investigator in Chicago. I grabbed my phone and logged into my bank app to transfer the funds. The screen flashed red. Access denied. I thought it was a glitch. I tried my credit cards to buy a cup of coffee at the corner store, and the machine declined every single one. I drove straight to my local bank branch, feeling a knot of panic tightening in my stomach. The teller looked at her computer screen and then looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. She immediately called the branch manager over. He was a man I had known for 15 years. He pulled me into his glass office and quickly closed the blinds. He looked at me nervously and told me that all my accounts, my retirement savings, my checking, and my access to the family trust had been completely frozen. Evelyn's corporate lawyers had worked through the night. They filed an emergency legal injunction claiming I had suffered a severe psychotic break. They submitted a sworn affidavit stating I was a danger to myself and others, claiming I was suffering from violent delusions that my dead brother was still alive. Because she was a billionaire, because she donated to all the right politicians, the judge signed off on it before the ink was even dry. She shut down my entire life with the stroke of a pen. She wanted to starve me of resources so I could not look for Samuel. She wanted me broken, and quiet. But Evelyn forgot one very important thing. I am not some helpless corporate executive who panics when the plastic stops working. I am a working man. I know how to survive, and I know how to hustle. I walked out of that bank and went straight to my rented garage. Sitting under a heavy tarp was my prized possession. A restored 1969 Mustang. I had spent 10 years rebuilding with my own 2 hands. I spent thousands of hours under the hood of that car. It was the only luxury I ever allowed myself. I loved that machine, but I loved my brother more. I called a guy I knew from the freight yards who collected classic muscle cars. I told him I needed cash today, and I told him no questions asked. He drove over, looked at the engine, and handed me $30,000 in wrapped bills. It was a mere fraction of what the car was truly worth, but it was untraceable. It was war money. With the cash packed into a heavy canvas bag, I drove my old pickup truck back to the soup kitchen where I first saw Ray. It took me 4 hours of walking the wet alleys and asking around the local shelters before I finally found him huddled under a bridge near the train tracks. He looked absolutely terrified when he saw me coming, thinking I was going to shake him down again. I did not grab him this time. I gently helped him up. I took him to a quiet 24-hour diner down the street and ordered him a hot steak dinner with all the sides. I sat across from him and pulled $500 bills from my pocket. I pushed the money across the table. I told him I needed the exact name and location of the facility where he saw my brother. Ray looked at the money and then looked at my face. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold his fork. He swallowed hard and told me everything. It was a private psychiatric hospice out in rural Indiana, a place called Oakwood Pines. It was built in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods and high security fences. It catered to wealthy families who had relatives they wanted to quietly disappear. Ray had been sent there by the state on a temporary overflow program before they kicked him out onto the streets. He gave me the address and drew a rough map of the layout on a napkin. I drove to Indiana that exact same night. I did not drive up to the front gate demanding answers. I am a logistics man. My entire career was built on understanding supply chains, reading schedules, and finding blind spots. I parked my truck half a mile away, hidden deep in a patch of trees, and hiked through the freezing mud until I had a clear view of the loading dock at the back of the facility. I lay in the cold brush for 2 full days. I watched the armed guards. I noted their shift changes down to the second. I tracked every single delivery truck that went in and out. I saw food deliveries, medical supplies, and laundry services. The laundry truck came every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock. The driver was a young guy who always stepped out to smoke a cigarette while the facility orderlies loaded the dirty linens and unloaded the clean ones. On the 3rd day, I finally made my move. I followed the laundry truck after it left the facility and pulled it over at a remote gas station miles down the highway. I walked up to the driver. He was just a kid, probably making minimum wage and hating his job. I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of $100 bills, $5,000 in cold hard cash. I showed it to him. I told him I needed to get inside the facility to check on a family member they were keeping from me illegally. I looked him dead in the eye and told him if he helped me, he gets the cash, and if he refused, he would have a very bad day. He looked at the thick stack of money, swallowed his fear, and nodded. The next afternoon, I was crouching inside the back of his delivery truck. The smell of industrial bleach and soiled sheets was overwhelming. The truck stopped at the loading dock of Oakwood Pines. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my breathing slow and steady. I squeezed myself into the bottom of a large, heavy canvas laundry cart. The driver piled clean towels and folded hospital sheets over me until I was completely buried in the dark. I could barely breathe. The rough fabric pressed tightly against my face. I heard the heavy metal doors of the loading dock open. I felt the cart jolt forward as a facility orderly pushed it inside the building. The wheels rattled loudly over the tile floor. I stayed perfectly still, ignoring the agonizing cramps in my legs. I heard the beep of a key card scanning and the heavy thud of a security door unlocking. We were in the lockdown ward. The orderly pushed the cart into a narrow supply closet, closed the door, and walked away. I waited exactly 5 minutes listening to the silence before pushing the heavy towels off and climbing out. The air in the lockdown ward was thick and stale, smelling of strong chemical sedatives and pure despair. The hallway was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. I kept low, moving silently past the glass window of the nurse station. Ray had told me the room number. Room 412 at the very end of the hall. I crept down the corridor, stepping lightly on the linoleum. I reached the heavy wooden door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open slowly and slipped inside. The room was small and painted a sickly pale green. There was a single hospital bed in the center of the room. A man was lying on it, staring blankly at the ceiling tiles. I walked closer, and all the breath suddenly left my lungs. It was Samuel. He is 55 years old. but he looked like he was pushing 70. His skin was gray and pulled tight over his cheekbones. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull. His hair was thin and completely white. His arms resting on the blanket were covered in dark purple bruises from countless intravenous needles. They had systematically starved him. They had drugged him into a living ghost. The sight of him broke something deep inside my soul. This was the boy I used to play basketball with in the driveway. This was the vibrant man who always had a bright, easy smile for everyone he met. Now he was a shell. I leaned over the cold metal rail of the bed and gently grabbed his frail hand. "Samuel," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Samuel, it is me. It is Harrison." For a long, terrible moment, he did not react at all. His eyes were glazed over, completely lost in a heavy chemical fog. Then slowly, agonizingly, he turned his head toward me. He blinked. The confusion in his face slowly gave way to recognition. The heavy chemical haze parted just enough for my little brother to truly see me. Tears pooled in his sunken eyes and began to roll down his gaunt cheeks. "Harrison," he choked out, his voice sounding like dry leaves rasping against rough pavement. "You came." "I am here, little brother," I said, fighting back the tears that threatened to blind me. "I am getting you out of this place right now. Can you walk?" He gripped my hand with a weak, trembling strength that broke my heart. "Before we go, you need to know why," he whispered, coughing weakly. "You need to know what our mother did. 12 years ago, I found her private corporate ledgers. The charities, Harrison. The foundations she set up in my name. They are not real. They are a massive tax evasion and money laundering machine for her corrupt corporate partners. She was washing hundreds of millions of dirty dollars. I confronted her. I told her I was going straight to the federal authorities. She invited me over to her house to talk things through. She poured me a drink. The next thing I knew, I woke up strapped to a bed in a dark room. She faked the car crash. She bribed the county medical examiner. She bought a John Doe body from the city morgue and burned it in my car so you and the rest of the world would think I was dead. She locked her own flesh and blood in a chemical prison just to keep her money safe. The words hit me like a physical blow to the jaw. The absolute evil of it was staggering. My mother, a billionaire who already had everything the world could offer, had thrown her own son into a living hell just to protect her dirty money. She stood beside me and watched me cry at his funeral, knowing full well he was drugged and chained to a bed in a rural Indiana asylum. The anger that flared inside me was no longer just a spark. It was a roaring, consuming inferno. I gently pulled Samuel up, wrapping his frail arm securely around my broad shoulder. "We are going to destroy her," I promised him, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "We are going to burn her empire straight to the ground." I took a step toward the door, supporting his heavy, dead weight, but before my hand could even reach the brass doorknob, the suffocating silence of the ward was shattered. A blaring, high-pitched siren suddenly erupted from the hallway speakers. Flashing red strobe lights bathed the small room in a violent, bloody glow. The automated robotic voice of the security system echoed through the walls, announcing an immediate lockdown. They knew I was here. The heavy ward doors slammed shut down the hall with loud magnetic clanks. We were trapped. The automated robotic voice of the security system echoed through the walls, announcing an immediate lockdown. Flashing red strobe lights washed the pale green walls of the psychiatric ward in a violent, bloody glow. The heavy magnetic doors down the corridor slammed shut with a deafening metallic clank. I had no time to think. I only had time to act. I grabbed Samuel by his frail arms and hauled his entire body over my right shoulder. He weighed almost nothing. The brother I remembered was a strong, vibrant man who used to play college basketball, but the man I was carrying felt like a hollow bag of dried bones. I kicked the door of his room wide open and stepped into the flashing hallway. 2 heavy-set orderlies were already sprinting down the corridor toward us. They were young, thick with muscle, and wearing crisp white uniforms. They looked at me like I was a trapped animal. They made a terrible mistake. I am 62 years old, but you do not survive 40 years managing heavy freight fleets on the south side of Chicago without learning how to handle yourself. When the first orderly lunged at me, I shifted Samuel's weight, planted my heavy work boots on the slick linoleum, and drove my calloused fist straight into his throat. He went down gagging and clutching his neck. The second orderly tried to tackle me around the waist. I brought my knee up hard, catching him square in the jaw. Bone crunched under the impact. He slumped against the wall, groaning and spitting blood onto the clean floor. I did not stop to look back. I carried my brother down that endless hallway, my lungs burning and my old knees screaming in protest. The smell of industrial bleach and sweat filled my nostrils. We burst through the heavy fire exit doors at the end of the wing and out into the freezing, biting wind of the Indiana night. The cold rain hit us like icy needles. The facility grounds were massive, surrounded by high chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Security guards were shouting in the distance, their flashlight beams cutting through the dark rain. I saw a security golf cart parked near the maintenance shed. The guards had abandoned it in their rush to get inside the building. I dumped Samuel onto the passenger seat and jumped behind the wheel. The keys were gone, but I spent decades fixing busted diesel trucks and rewiring broken ignitions. I ripped the plastic panel under the steering column off with my bare hands, found the ignition wires, and twisted them together. The electric motor hummed to life. I slammed my foot on the accelerator. We shot across the wet, muddy grass. Shouts echoed from the building behind us as men poured out of the exit doors. I steered the cart straight toward the weakest point of the perimeter fence, which was an old maintenance gate secured by a rusty chain. We hit it at full speed. The impact shattered the cart's windshield. Glass and rusted metal tore into my arms and face. We spun out into the muddy ditch on the other side of the fence. We were bleeding, covered in thick mud and completely exhausted, but we were outside the wire. I dragged Samuel to his feet. We stumbled through the dense woods for what felt like miles. Every step was pure agony. My chest heaved and I tasted copper in the back of my throat. We finally reached a dark, deserted country road. A rusted, beat-up sedan was parked outside a closed auto parts store. I busted the window with a rock, unlocked the heavy door, and hot-wired the engine just like the cart. I pushed Samuel into the back seat, put the car in drive, and tore off down the highway, leaving the flashing lights of the asylum far behind us. I drove for 3 hours straight, putting as much distance between us and that nightmare facility as humanly possible. We crossed the state line and pulled into a cheap, run-down motel off the interstate. The neon vacancy sign flickered weakly in the pouring rain. I paid for a room in cash using the money from my sold Mustang. I carried Samuel inside and locked the heavy deadbolt behind us. The room smelled of stale smoke and damp carpet. I laid my brother down on the sagging mattress. That was when the real horror began. Samuel started to detox. Evelyn had kept him pumped full of heavy mind-altering sedatives for 12 long years to keep him compliant and silent. Now those powerful chemicals were leaving his system. His body went into severe shock. He shook violently, sweating right through the cheap motel sheets. I spent the entire night sitting by his side. I wiped his burning forehead with cold, wet towels. I held his frail shoulders down when the brutal convulsions threatened to tear him apart. I listened to him cry out in pure terror, trapped in a chemical nightmare created by our own mother. I sat there in the dim light of that filthy motel room, looking at the bruised, skeletal man who used to be my best friend. The rage inside me hardened into something cold and permanent. I promised him right then and there that Evelyn would pay for every drop of sweat, every bruise, and every stolen year. By late the next morning, the worst of the tremors had finally passed. Samuel opened his eyes. The cloudy, dead stare was completely gone. For the first time in over a decade, my brother looked at me with clear, lucid eyes. He tried to sit up, his voice nothing but a dry rasp. "Harrison," he whispered, "you got me out." I handed him a plastic cup of water. He drank it greedily, his frail hands shaking. Then he looked at me, and the fear in his eyes was replaced by a deep, crushing sorrow. He told me that Evelyn did not just fake his death to silence him about her corrupt charities. She had another motive, a much darker and incredibly lucrative motive. Samuel took a ragged breath and explained everything. He owned a massive stake in the family real estate empire. His shares were worth nearly $50 million. Evelyn needed that money to cover her laundering tracks and expand her corrupt operations, but she could not just take it from him while he was alive. The trust was ironclad. Samuel looked at me, his breathing ragged and shallow. When she buried that empty box 12 years ago, my entire estate went to probate, he explained, and because I was legally declared dead, every single penny, all $50 million, was legally transferred to my grieving widow. It all went to Claire. I sat back in the cheap plastic chair, letting those staggering words sink into my brain. $50 million transferred to my sister-in-law, Claire. I closed my eyes and pictured Claire at the funeral 12 years ago. I remembered her pale, tear-stained face. I remembered how she clung to my arm, sobbing uncontrollably as they lowered the casket into the cold ground. She was a sweet, quiet white woman who had loved my brother deeply. They had a beautiful wedding. I remembered her trembling hands as she held a single white rose over the grave. The truth hit me like a speeding freight train. Evelyn had not only destroyed my brother, she had mercilessly manipulated Claire. Evelyn must have used Claire's crippling grief to take control of those shares. Evelyn was a master manipulator, and Claire was soft and trusting. Claire was just another innocent victim in my mother's twisted game. She was a pawn, completely unaware that her husband was actually rotting in a rural asylum just a few hours away while Evelyn controlled the stolen fortune. I realized right then that we needed an inside ally. We needed someone who had direct access to Evelyn's high society world, someone who could help us expose the truth from the inside. Claire was the key. If I told her Samuel was alive, she would turn on Evelyn in a heartbeat. She would help us bring the whole corrupt empire crashing down. I told Samuel to rest and lock the door. I left the motel room, walked down the rain-slicked highway to a corner convenience store, and bought a prepaid burner phone. I stood under the dripping awning of the store and dialed Claire's private cell number. I still knew it by heart. It rang 4 times before she finally answered. Her voice was soft and polite, exactly as I remembered it. "Claire." I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It is Harrison. You need to listen to me very carefully. You are not a widow. Samuel is alive." I heard a sharp, sudden gasp on the other end of the line, followed by dead silence. I told her everything. I told her I had him, that we were safe, and that Evelyn had lied to all of us for 12 years. I told her to tell no one and to meet me at an old abandoned diner on the outskirts of the city. I hung up the phone, believing I had just secured our ultimate salvation. I had absolutely no idea I had just walked us straight into a fatal trap. I told Samuel we were meeting Claire. I watched a flicker of light return to his sunken, dead eyes. For the first time since I pulled him out of that chemical hellhole, he actually smiled. He thought his nightmare was over. He thought the woman he married, the woman he promised to love and protect, was coming to save him. We waited in the back room of a run-down, abandoned diner on the edge of the county line. The place smelled of burnt coffee, old frying oil, and wet dust. It was the kind of place where truck drivers stopped at 2 a.m. to keep from falling asleep at the wheel. I knew the owner from my old freight-hauling days. He was a good man who owed me a favor from a long time ago. He gave us the private back room near the kitchen and promised to keep his mouth firmly shut. Samuel sat in a torn vinyl booth, shaking violently. He was still fighting the brutal withdrawal from 12 years of heavy sedatives. His hands trembled so much he could barely hold the glass of tap water I gave him. But he kept looking at the wooden door. He was waiting for his wife. I patted his thin shoulder and told him she was coming. I told him everything was going to be all right. I was an absolute fool. I had survived 62 years in Chicago by trusting my gut, but my desperate need to see my brother happy made me completely blind to the danger. The heavy back door finally creaked open. Claire stepped inside. She was soaking wet from the pouring rain, but she was wearing a long designer coat that probably cost more than my first freight truck. She dropped her expensive leather purse on the greasy floor and ran straight to the booth. She threw her arms around Samuel. She burst into violent theatrical tears. She kissed his hollow cheeks and stroked his thin gray hair. "Oh my God," she kept sobbing, her voice echoing in the small room. "Oh my God, Samuel, you are alive." I stood in the corner of the room with my arms crossed, watching them. A heavy knot of anxiety started to loosen in my chest. I genuinely thought we finally had an ally. I thought Claire was just another innocent victim of my billionaire mother, just like the rest of us. Samuel clung to her, weeping like a lost child. He buried his face in her expensive coat, pouring out 12 years of pain and isolation. But as I stood there watching her performance, my old survival instincts began to scream. Something was deeply wrong. Claire was crying loudly, but her body was completely rigid. Her eyes were darting around the small room, taking a rapid inventory of the exits. And then I saw it. While she was hugging her resurrected husband, her left arm dropped behind his back out of his line of sight. She pulled back the wet sleeve of her coat and checked her gold wristwatch. She did it quickly, but I saw it. It was a cold, calculated, mechanical movement. She was not a loving wife holding her long-lost husband. She was a woman waiting for a timer to run out. A freezing shiver ran down my spine. I told Claire I needed to step out into the main dining area to pay the owner for the room to ensure we would not be disturbed. I told her I would be right back. She nodded without looking at me, keeping her face buried in Samuel's neck, pretending to sob. I walked out of the back room and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. I did not go to the cash register. I walked straight to the large front windows of the empty diner. The rain was coming down in heavy gray sheets, blurring the streetlights into glowing smears. I looked out into the dark parking lot. My breath hitched in my throat. 4 local police cruisers were rolling down the highway, running completely dark with no sirens and no flashing lights. They were moving in a tight tactical formation. Right behind the police cars were 2 massive black sport utility vehicles with deeply tinted windows. I recognized those vehicles immediately. They belonged to Evelyn's private corporate security team. The exact same men who had dragged me out of my childhood home and tossed me into the mud like garbage. They pulled into the diner parking lot with terrifying precision, boxing in every single possible exit. The heavy doors swung open and armed police officers stepped out into the pouring rain right alongside my mother's highly paid mercenaries. The brutal truth hit me with the force of a swinging sledgehammer. Claire did not come to rescue Samuel. Claire came to deliver him. The $50 million in real estate shares was not stolen from her by my mother. It was her payment. She had traded her husband's life for a billionaire fortune. She was in on the whole sick scheme from the very beginning. She knew Samuel was locked in a chemical prison for 12 years while she played the grieving wealthy widow at high society galas, and I had just handed him right back to her on a silver platter. There was no time for anger. There was no time for regret. I spun around on my heels and sprinted back toward the private room. I kicked the door open with my heavy work boot. Claire jumped back from the booth, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. She saw the absolute murder written all over my face. She knew that I knew. I did not say a single word to her. I grabbed Samuel by the collar of his shirt and hauled him out of the vinyl booth. He cried out in total confusion, reaching his frail hands back for his wife. Claire stood up and started screaming for help at the top of her lungs. She was giving the signal to the men outside. I shoved Samuel hard through the swinging doors into the filthy diner kitchen. The owner looked up from the hot grill in absolute shock. I tossed him a thick wad of cash from my pocket and yelled for him to get down on the floor. I heard the heavy glass front doors of the diner shatter into 1,000 pieces. The police and the private mercenaries were violently breaching the building. They were shouting tactical orders, tearing the dining room apart, looking for us. Samuel was stumbling, his weak legs giving out from exhaustion and the lingering psychiatric drugs in his blood. I threw his arm over my broad shoulder and practically carried his dead weight toward the rear exit. The metal back door was rusted shut and barred. I slammed my heavy work boots against the handle, kicking it with all the desperate strength of a man fighting for his family. The metal lock broke with a loud crack, and the door flew open into the dark, narrow alley behind the diner. We stumbled out into the freezing rain. I dragged Samuel behind a row of overflowing industrial dumpsters just as the kitchen doors burst open behind us. Bright tactical flashlight beams cut through the heavy rain sweeping the alleyway. I pulled Samuel down into the freezing mud and pressed my calloused hand tightly over his mouth to keep him from making a sound. We huddled in the absolute darkness, breathing in the rotting stench of old garbage and wet concrete. I watched the heavy combat boots of Evelyn's mercenaries splashing through the puddles mere feet away from our faces. They had their weapons drawn and ready. One of the men was speaking rapidly into a shoulder radio, confirming that the targets had fled out the back and were heading for the main road. I held my breath, praying to a God I had not spoken to in decades. The mercenaries spread out, running down the alley toward the streetlights. They thought we had kept running blindly into the night. They did not realize we were hiding right under their noses in the filth. I waited for 10 agonizing minutes until the heavy footsteps faded completely into the noise of the storm. I pulled Samuel up from the mud and we moved in the exact opposite direction, creeping through the flooded backyards of abandoned industrial lots. We walked for miles in the pouring rain, sticking to the deepest shadows. My 62-year-old knees were screaming in absolute agony. My chest burned with every ragged breath. Samuel was weeping silently as we walked, finally comprehending that his own wife had sold his soul to the devil for real estate shares. We finally found temporary shelter in a rotting abandoned warehouse near the old train tracks. The roof was caving in, but it kept us out of the freezing rain. I sat Samuel down on a broken wooden crate and wrapped my wet, heavy jacket around his shaking shoulders. I pulled out the prepaid burner phone I had bought earlier that day. I needed to know exactly what Evelyn and Claire were doing. I opened the local news application. My face was plastered across the very front page. The bold black headline made my blood turn to solid ice. It said a dangerous former logistics manager had suffered a violent psychotic break. Claire had just held a highly publicized press conference on the steps of the local police precinct. There was a video of her standing in front of the flashing news cameras, crying perfect theatrical tears. She told the entire world that I had lost my mind with grief over my dead brother. She claimed I had broken into a palliative care facility and abducted a random innocent homeless man because my shattered brain truly believed the man was Samuel. She begged the public to help the police find me before I hurt the poor homeless man or myself. Evelyn's corporate lawyers had immediately filed an emergency federal kidnapping charge against me. They secured a strict restraining order for Claire, portraying her as a terrified victim. But the absolute worst part was printed at the very bottom of the article. Because I was legally considered a violent and delusional kidnapper who had assaulted medical staff during the breakout, the police had officially authorized the use of deadly force. And Evelyn's private corporate security team had been officially deputized by the city to assist in the manhunt. We were no longer just running from my ruthless mother. We were federal fugitives. We had no money, no shelter, and no legal identities. Samuel was legally a dead man, and I was a wanted kidnapper. The entire city of Chicago was actively looking for us, and the armed men hunting us had a blank check to put bullets in our heads and call it self-defense. I looked at Samuel sitting in the dark, shivering in his wet clothes. He had lost his life, his freedom, and the woman he loved. I had lost my home, my reputation, and my safety. But as I sat in that freezing abandoned warehouse, listening to the rain beat heavily against the rusted tin roof, I did not feel defeated. I felt a cold, absolute clarity settling over my mind. Evelyn and Claire thought they could crush a working man by taking away his bank accounts and calling him crazy on the evening news. They thought they could bury the truth under a massive mountain of fake tears and corporate lawyers. They forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot that I spent 40 years moving heavy loads through the worst storms and the most dangerous roads in this country. I know how to navigate the dark. I know how to carry the heavy weight. The trap had been sprung perfectly, and the iron jaws had closed right around us, but they did not snap our necks. Now it was my turn to build a trap of my own. We sat in the freezing dark of that rotting warehouse listening to the rain hammer the tin roof. I looked at my brother. Samuel was curled up on a broken wooden pallet, shivering in his wet clothes, trying to process the absolute horror that his own wife had sold him out. For 12 years, he had been trapped in a chemical nightmare waiting for Claire to save him. Now he knew the truth. She was never coming. She traded his life for a $50 million real estate fortune. I realized something very clearly in that exact moment. You cannot punch a billionaire in the face and expect to win. Evelyn had private armies at her disposal. She had powerful politicians and judges on her payroll. She had the local police actively hunting us down with a green light to shoot on sight. If I tried to drag Samuel into a police station right now, we would both be dead before we even reached the front desk. They would call it a tragic confrontation with a deranged, violent kidnapper. I had spent 40 years of my life using my heavy hands and my strong back to solve my problems. I managed massive freight operations on the south side of Chicago. I fixed broken diesel engines and dealt with tough drivers. But I could not fix this situation with muscle. To destroy a billionaire, you do not use your fists. You use paper. You use the very system they manipulated to build their corrupt empire. I reached into my wet jacket and pulled out the prepaid burner phone I had bought earlier that day. I dialed the only other person in this entire city who knew the truth. Ray. The homeless man who had given me the silver cross in the alley. He answered on the second ring. I kept my voice low and steady. I told him we were alive, but we were being hunted by the authorities and by Evelyn's private mercenaries. I told him we had absolutely nothing but the wet clothes on our backs. Ray did not hesitate for a single second. He told me he knew a secure place where the police would never bother to look. He gave me an address for a boarded-up building deep in the south side. I hung up the phone and helped Samuel to his feet. We moved quietly through the dark alleys, sticking to the deepest shadows, avoiding the main roads where the police cruisers were patrolling with their spotlights, sweeping the streets. It took us 2 grueling hours of agonizing walking to reach the address. Ray was waiting for us by a rusted metal door in a garbage-filled back alley. He hurried us inside quickly and led us down a dark, narrow flight of concrete stairs. We entered a damp, hidden basement illuminated by a single flickering hanging light bulb. The walls were lined with old rusted filing cabinets and heavy stacks of cardboard boxes. Sitting at a folding table in the center of the room was a man I did not recognize. He was an older black man, maybe my age, with thick gray glasses and a face that carried decades of deep exhaustion and quiet, simmering anger. Ray locked the heavy metal door behind us and slid a heavy wooden beam across the frame. He looked at me and pointed to the man sitting at the table. He said his name was Walter. Walter was not just some random guy off the street. 15 years ago, Walter was one of the sharpest forensic accountants in the entire city of Chicago. He worked for a prestigious financial firm that audited massive corporate charities and elite trust funds. And 15 years ago, Walter got assigned to audit Evelyn's newly formed philanthropic foundations. He started digging into the numbers and he started seeing the cracks in the foundation. He noticed the ghost accounts, the offshore shell companies, the massive scale of her tax evasion. He tried to do the right thing. He tried to blow the whistle and alert the federal authorities. But Evelyn was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. She did not just fire Walter. She utterly destroyed him. She planted forged financial documents on his computer, making it look like Walter was the one actively embezzling funds from the charity. She completely ruined his pristine reputation. He lost his professional license, his career, his home, and his family. He spent a year in a federal penitentiary for a white-collar crime my mother had committed. Ever since he got out, he had been living entirely in the shadows, working off the books, scraping by, and waiting. He had been waiting for 15 long years for a real chance to strike back at the woman who ruined his life. I looked around that damp, freezing basement. It was a truly pathetic sight. 4 old, broken men hiding underground like rats. I was a retired freight manager running from a fabricated federal kidnapping charge. Samuel was a drugged, traumatized ghost who legally did not even exist. Ray was a homeless bookkeeper cast aside and forgotten by society. And Walter was a disgraced accountant with a ruined name and a criminal record. We were exactly the kind of people billionaires like Evelyn stepped on every single day without a second thought. We were the invisible men of the world. But as I looked into their eyes in the dim light of that basement, I saw something incredibly powerful. I saw men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous creature on the face of the earth. I pulled up a broken folding chair and sat down at the table. I laid everything out for them. I told Walter the entire horrifying truth about the fake funeral. I told him about the chemical prison where they kept my brother locked away for over a decade. I told him about Claire trading her husband's life for $50 million in stolen real estate shares. Walter did not look surprised. He did not gasp. He simply adjusted his thick glasses and nodded slowly. He reached down and opened a thick, worn leather binder on the table. It was filled with 15 years of meticulous, obsessive research on my mother and her corrupt corporate empire. Walter leaned forward, his voice low and steady. He told us that Evelyn was a brilliant, ruthless tactician, but she had one major vulnerability. She was old school. She did not trust digital clouds. She did not trust encrypted servers floating in cyberspace. She knew that anything placed on the internet could eventually be hacked by a smart enough kid with a laptop. So she kept her most damning secrets grounded in the physical world. Walter pulled out a detailed architectural blueprint of a massive, towering corporate building. He pointed a long, calloused finger at the top floor. He explained that Evelyn's entire legal shield, her whole billionaire status, rested on one massive, fatal flaw. To build her fake charities and wash her dirty money, she needed the initial seed funds. To get that massive amount of seed money, she needed the life insurance payout and the legal transfer of Samuel's estate to Claire. To execute that transfer smoothly, she needed an absolutely airtight death certificate. Walter explained that the original faked DNA records from the corrupt county coroner 12 years ago, the actual documents proving she bought a nameless John Doe body from the city morgue to burn in that car, were not digitized anywhere. They were physical paper documents, and right beside those fake reports sat the ultimate prize, the Black Ledger. The physical handwritten ledger book detailing every single bribe, every offshore routing number, every fake charity account, and every corrupt politician she had paid off over the last decade. Walter looked at me, his eyes burning with a cold, sharp fire. He said if we get our hands on that physical ledger and those fake DNA reports, we do not just clear your name, Harrison. We tear down her entire empire overnight. We put Evelyn and Claire in a federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. We take back every single penny they stole from Samuel and we burn their legacy to ash. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline cut right through my deep physical exhaustion. My ribs ached and my clothes were still damp, but my mind was firing on all cylinders. I leaned over the table and asked him exactly where these documents were kept. Walter tapped the top floor of the blueprint again. He said they are kept in a heavy biometric safe securely bolted inside Evelyn's private executive office. Her massive corporate headquarters, located right in the wealthy heart of downtown Chicago. I stared hard at the blueprint spread across the table. I managed logistics and freight routes for 40 years. I know how to read building schematics. I know how to spot security bottlenecks and access points. I looked at the detailed notes Walter had gathered over the years. The building was an absolute fortress. It had 24-hour armed security patrols walking the perimeter. It had keycard-restricted elevators that only went to specific floors. It had high-definition cameras covering every square inch of the hallways, lobbies, and parking garages. And the heavy steel safe itself required Evelyn's actual physical fingerprint to open. "We cannot hack it remotely," Walter said, his voice flat and completely serious. "We cannot just sit in this damp basement and type our way into her vault. There is no backdoor digital access to the safe. There is no network connection to exploit." The harsh reality of the situation settled heavily over the damp concrete room. Samuel was leaning against the cold wall, holding a cup of hot tea, his breathing shallow but his eyes wide and finally focused. Ray was nervously wringing his hands, looking back and forth between the blueprints and the heavy metal door. I looked at Walter and asked him the only question that mattered. I asked him what we had to do. Walter did not blink. He looked at the four of us and laid out the terrifying truth. He told me the only way to get those documents, the only way to save our lives and expose Evelyn, was to walk right through the front doors of the most secure building in the city of Chicago. We had to physically infiltrate a corporate fortress guarded by armed, highly trained mercenaries who already had a green light from the local police to kill us on sight. We had to break into a state-of-the-art biometric vault located on the highest floor with no weapons, no legal identities, and a massive citywide manhunt actively closing in on us. It sounded completely impossible. It sounded like a desperate suicide mission designed by a madman. But as I looked at my younger brother, clutching the damp blanket around his shaking shoulders, I knew there was absolutely no other choice. We were not going to run and hide in the shadows anymore. We were going to step into the light. We were going to walk straight into the belly of the beast and take back everything they stole from us. We sat around that rotting wooden table in the damp basement, breathing in the smell of old paper and cold concrete. Walter spread his wrinkled blueprints across the surface and pointed to a date circled in red marker on his calendar. This weekend, Evelyn was hosting her annual High Society charity gala at the corporate headquarters downtown. She called it the Samuel Memorial Fundraiser. She was gathering politicians, celebrities, and wealthy investors to write massive checks in honor of the son she had secretly locked in a chemical prison. The sheer sickening audacity of it made my heavy hands curl into tight fists. She was using my brother's fake grave as a golden goose to wash more dirty money. But Walter looked at me with a sharp gleam in his tired eyes and tapped the blueprint. He said this gala was not just a sick joke. It was our only tactical opening. Evelyn operated her building like a military fortress. On any normal night, the executive suites on the top floor were heavily guarded by armed patrols. But on the night of the gala, she was expecting over 500 elite guests in the grand ballroom on the second floor. Walter explained that her private security team would be stretched completely thin. Every guard, every camera operator, and every floor manager would be focused on protecting the billionaires and politicians drinking champagne downstairs. The top floor, where the biometric safe held the black ledger and the fake DNA reports, would be running on a skeleton crew. It was a calculated risk. It was a massive gamble, but it was the only real chance we had. I looked at Samuel. He was sitting on a broken crate wrapped in a frayed blanket. He was still shivering from the drug withdrawals. His skin was pale and his eyes looked so tired. He was our ultimate weapon. When the time came, Samuel walking into that ballroom breathing and speaking would destroy Evelyn's lie instantly. But we could not just walk him through the front doors right now. If we marched a frail, undocumented man into a room full of Evelyn's paid police escorts without the hard legal proof in our hands, she would simply claim I had kidnapped a delusional homeless man. She would have him committed back to that rural asylum before the night was over, and I would be thrown into a federal penitentiary for the rest of my life. We had to secure the paper trail first. We needed the black ledger. We needed the fake coroner reports. We needed the physical proof of her crimes before we played our final card. I took a deep breath and looked at Walter and Ray. I told them I spent 40 years managing logistics and freight routes on the south side of Chicago. I did not know how to hack a computer network, but I knew exactly how to move invisible cargo through a heavily guarded loading dock. I knew how the supply chain worked. I told them we were going to walk right through the front door, disguised as the one thing billionaires never pay attention to: the hired help. I walked up to the street level and used my prepaid burner phone to make a few calls. When you manage trucking fleets for 4 decades, you build a network of blue-collar brothers who owe you favors. I called a man named Marcus. Not the Marcus from Savannah, but an old dispatcher who handled refrigerated transport for high-end catering companies in the city. I did not tell him the whole story. I just told him I was in deep trouble and I needed a massive favor. He owed me for saving his job 10 years ago when he wrecked a rig on the interstate. Within 2 hours, Marcus sent me a secure text message containing the complete delivery manifest for the catering company working Evelyn's gala. He also left a heavy plastic bag behind a dumpster near his freight yard. Inside that bag were 3 crisp white catering uniforms, black aprons, and official vendor delivery caps. I brought the uniforms back down to the basement. Walter took the vendor names from the manifest and used an old heavy-duty laptop and a laminating machine he had scavenged to forge our employee credentials. He printed out 2 perfectly faked identification badges with barcodes that would pass a visual inspection by an underpaid dock guard. We spent the next 48 hours in that freezing basement running rigorous drills. Walter traced the guard patrol routes on the blueprints with a green marker. He calculated that we would have exactly a 7-minute window between the time the executive floor guard walked down the east corridor and the time he returned from the west stairwell. 7 minutes to bypass the biometric lock on the safe, grab the documents, and get back to the service elevator. I practiced taking apart the heavy catering cart we had stolen from an alley behind a local hotel. I figured out how to build a hidden compartment under the bottom shelf where we could hide Walter's bulky bypass equipment and any tools we might need. We went over the plan again and again until my throat was completely dry. Samuel watched us the entire time. He was eating canned soup and slowly regaining a tiny fraction of his strength. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and apologized for dragging me into this deadly mess. I walked over and put my calloused hand on his thin shoulder. I told him he never dragged me into anything. I told him our mother had dragged us both to hell, but we were going to climb out together. I promised him that by the end of the weekend, he would have his life back. Saturday night finally arrived. The city of Chicago was wrapped in a freezing, heavy downpour. The streets were slick with black rain, and the wind howled through the concrete canyons downtown. Ray managed to borrow a battered white delivery van from a friend at a local shelter. We loaded the modified catering cart into the back. I put on the crisp white uniform and tied the black apron around my waist. I looked at myself in the cracked side mirror of the van. I did not look like a desperate fugitive on the run from federal kidnapping charges. I looked like an invisible, older working man. I looked like someone who was just there to serve expensive food and clean up dirty plates. Walter sat in the passenger seat wearing the same uniform, holding a clipboard tight against his chest. Ray stayed behind the steering wheel, gripping it with nervous, sweaty hands. I told Ray to keep the engine running in the alley 2 blocks down from the loading dock and wait for my signal. I told Samuel to stay completely hidden in the back of the van under a pile of heavy moving blankets until I came to get him. Ray put the van in gear and drove us right into the heart of the wealthy financial district. The massive glass and steel skyscraper towering over the street belonged entirely to Evelyn's corporate holding company. Bright spotlights illuminated the grand front entrance. A long line of black luxury cars and expensive limousines stretched down the block. Valets in sharp red jackets were opening doors for politicians, judges, and wealthy socialites. Everyone was dressed in expensive tuxedos and glittering gowns, ready to drink champagne and celebrate the memory of a dead son who was currently shivering in the back of a delivery van just 1 street over. The sickening hypocrisy of it made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. Ray steered the van away from the glittering front entrance and pulled into the dark, narrow alley leading to the underground loading dock. The rain beat heavily against the windshield as we approached the heavy steel security gate. An armed guard in a yellow rain slicker stepped out of a booth and held up his hand. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but I kept my face completely blank. I rolled down the window and handed him the forged manifest and our fake identification badges. I complained about the terrible weather and told him we were bringing the backup dessert carts for the ballroom. The guard barely even looked at our faces. He scanned the barcodes on the badges with his handheld device. The machine beeped a solid green. Walter had done his job perfectly. The guard handed the badges back and pressed a button inside his booth. The heavy steel gate slowly rolled open. We drove down the steep concrete ramp into the underground loading dock. The area was absolute organized chaos. Delivery drivers were yelling orders. Catering staff were running back and forth, pushing massive carts of food and crates of expensive alcohol. We parked the van near a stack of wooden pallets. Ray gave me a silent nod, gripping the steering wheel tight. Walter and I jumped out of the cab and pulled our modified cart from the back. We blended right into the frantic crowd of workers. We pushed the cart through the heavy double doors into the chaotic service corridor. No one stopped us. No one asked us a single question. We were exactly where we were supposed to be. We were the invisible workforce. We navigated the maze of lower corridors using the mental map we had burned into our brains over the last 2 days. We bypassed the busy kitchen area and slipped into the restricted freight hallway. At the very end of the hall was the private executive service elevator. It required a special magnetic key to operate. Walter pulled a small black device from his pocket, plugged it into the card reader panel, and typed rapidly on a tiny keyboard. The light on the panel flashed from red to green. The heavy metal doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. We pushed the catering cart inside the elevator and hit the button for the 50th floor. The doors closed, sealing us inside the quiet metal box. As the elevator began its rapid ascent, my stomach dropped. This was the point of no return. We were climbing straight into the most dangerous part of the building. I looked at Walter. His hands were shaking slightly, but his jaw was set with fierce determination. He had waited 15 years for this exact moment to clear his name. I had waited my entire life to finally stand up to the woman who used her family as disposable chess pieces. I reached under the bottom shelf of the cart and pulled out a heavy steel wrench I had brought just in case. I gripped the cold metal handle tight, hiding it behind my back under my black apron. The digital display above the door counted the floors. 45, 46, 47. The tension in the small elevator car was thick enough to choke on. 48, 49. I braced my heavy legs and took a deep, steady breath. 50. The elevator chimed softly. The heavy metal doors slid open, revealing the plush, carpeted hallway of the executive suite. The lights were dimmed for the evening. It was supposed to be completely empty. The guard patrol was supposed to be on the opposite side of the floor for another 5 minutes. But as the doors opened wide, my blood turned to solid ice. Standing directly in front of the elevator, waiting for the doors to open, was not a random rent-a-cop. It was a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing a tailored black suit and a tactical earpiece. I recognized his scarred face instantly. It was Evelyn's ruthless head of security, the exact same man who had dragged me out of my childhood home and tossed me into the mud. He had a custom suppressed pistol holstered tightly to his chest. He looked at me in my white catering uniform, and a cruel, knowing smile spread slowly across his scarred face. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked like a hunter who had just caught a rat in a trap. He reached slowly under his tailored jacket, wrapping his large hand around the grip of his weapon. The heavy metal doors of the executive elevator slid open with a soft chime that sounded like a funeral bell. Standing right there in the plush carpeted hallway was Evelyn's head of security. He was a mountain of a man in a tailored black suit. I remembered his scarred face from the night he threw me out of my own childhood home. He had that arrogant, mocking smirk on his face. He looked at my white catering uniform, and his cold eyes practically laughed at me. He thought I was just a tired old man who had walked right into his own slaughter. He reached his massive hand inside his jacket for his weapon. His movements were smooth and practiced. He was a professional mercenary used to intimidating people into submission. But he forgot one very important thing about working men. We do not panic. We do not freeze. When you spend your entire life protecting your family from a world that wants to crush them, you learn how to survive. There was no time for flashy martial arts. There was no time to think or plan or negotiate. All I had was the heavy steel wrench hidden behind my back and the furious roaring fire of a brother who had been pushed too far. I did not swing the wrench right away. Instead, I lowered my shoulder, planted my heavy work boots onto the floor of the elevator, and charged forward like a runaway freight train. I hit him right in the center of his chest before his gun could clear the holster. The sheer impact forced the breath out of his lungs in a loud, heavy grunt. We flew backward out of the elevator together and tumbled into the grand executive lobby. He was strong and incredibly heavy, but I had 40 years of lifting diesel engine blocks and hauling freight crates stored in my muscles. I drove my legs forward, pushing his massive frame across the room with everything I had. We slammed incredibly hard into the floor-to-ceiling glass partition that separated the lobby from the conference rooms. The thick frosted glass spiderwebbed instantly and shattered into a million sparkling pieces around us. We crashed through the metal framing and landed on the polished hardwood floor in a tangled, violent heap. The fall knocked the wind completely out of me. My 62-year-old bones rattled with a sickening jolt, but I could not stop moving. I scrambled to get on top of him, raising the heavy steel wrench in my right hand. Before I could bring it down, his massive fist shot out and caught me squarely in the ribs. The blow was absolutely devastating. It felt like being kicked in the chest by a wild horse. I heard a loud, sickening crack, and a blinding flash of white-hot pain exploded in my side. I dropped the wrench and gasped for air, falling sideways onto the hard floor. The security chief rolled over and climbed to his knees. He wiped a streak of blood from his scarred cheek and looked down at me with pure, murderous intent. He reached for his holstered gun again. I knew if he pulled that trigger, it was all over. Samuel would die in that cold delivery van. Walter would go back to federal prison. Evelyn and Claire would win everything. I let out a guttural roar from the very bottom of my soul. I ignored the excruciating pain in my cracked ribs and threw my body forward, grabbing his ankle. I yanked his leg as hard as I possibly could, pulling him completely off balance. He fell forward, dropping his weapon on the carpet. We grappled on the floor like wild animals fighting for survival. It was an ugly, breathless, brutal struggle. He punched me in the jaw, making my vision swim in circles. He wrapped his thick, heavy hands around my throat, squeezing hard. I could smell his expensive cologne mixed with the copper scent of blood. I felt my oxygen getting cut off. Dark spots danced at the edges of my vision. I thrashed wildly, throwing my arms out in a desperate, frantic panic. My right hand hit the base of a heavy, solid brass reading lamp sitting on a fallen side table next to the couch. I grabbed the thick metal base, wrapped my calloused fingers tightly around the cold brass, and swung it upward with every single ounce of strength I had left in my dying body. The heavy brass slammed directly into the side of his skull with a loud, hollow thud. His eyes rolled back into his head immediately. His brutal grip on my throat instantly loosened. His massive body slumped forward as dead weight pinning me to the shattered floor. I pushed his unconscious body off my chest and rolled onto my hands and knees. I coughed violently, gasping for the cool, conditioned air of the executive office. Every single breath sent a sharp, stabbing pain through my cracked ribs. Blood dripped from a cut above my right eye, stinging my vision. I dragged myself to my feet, leaning heavily against the shattered window frame to keep from collapsing. Walter stepped cautiously out of the elevator, holding his clipboard like a useless plastic shield. He looked at the shattered glass, the unconscious guard, and my bloodied, swollen face in absolute shock. I looked at Walter and told him to stop staring and get moving. I bent down and kicked the guard's discarded pistol far under a heavy mahogany desk, completely out of reach. I reached down to the unconscious guard's belt and unclipped his heavy black security radio. I shoved it deep into my black apron pocket. We hurried down the long, silent corridor toward the double mahogany doors at the very end. The polished plaque on the wall read, Chief Executive Officer. I pushed the heavy doors open and we stepped into my mother's private sanctuary. The office was absolutely massive. It was a monument to her unbridled greed and corruption. There were genuine oil paintings on the walls, thick Persian rugs on the floor, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the glittering nighttime skyline of Chicago. Down below in the grand ballroom, she was drinking champagne and accepting praise while her own flesh and blood bled onto her expensive carpet upstairs. I felt a massive surge of absolute disgust. I walked behind her large custom desk and pulled aside a large abstract painting on the back wall just like Walter's blueprints indicated. Behind the canvas was the vault. It was not a normal combination safe. It was a state-of-the-art biometric vault built directly into the reinforced steel of the building framework. The sleek black panel had a glowing blue fingerprint scanner and a digital keypad. Walter walked over and adjusted his thick gray glasses. His hands were shaking visibly, but his eyes were focused and incredibly sharp. This was his moment. This was the moment he took back his dignity after 15 years of living in the shadows as a disgraced, ruined man. He pulled his black apron up and took out the specialized bypass drive he had spliced together in that damp basement. It looked like a messy block of raw circuit boards connected by red and black wires. He knelt down in front of the safe and used a small screwdriver to pop the plastic casing off the biometric panel. He exposed a chaotic mess of internal wiring. He looked up at me and said it would take a few minutes to run the decryption algorithm and trick the scanner into thinking Evelyn's physical fingerprint was present. I told him to work as fast as humanly possible. Walter connected the alligator clips of his bypass drive to the exposed wires of the safe. The small screen on his device lit up with streams of green numbers running down the display. He typed frantically, overriding the primary security protocols. I stood near the heavy wooden doors, keeping watch and holding my severely bruised ribs. The silence in the office was deafening. The only sounds were the soft, rapid clicking of Walter's keyboard and my own ragged, heavy breathing. Then my blood ran entirely cold. The black security radio sitting deep inside my apron pocket suddenly crackled to life with a loud burst of sharp static. A firm, authoritative voice echoed from the tiny speaker. Alpha Team Leader, respond. Radio check. I froze completely still. I stared at the radio through the fabric of my apron. Walter stopped typing and looked back at me, his face pale with sudden sheer terror. The voice on the radio spoke again, this time louder and much more urgent. Alpha Team Leader, respond immediately. You missed your perimeter check. Come in, Alpha Team. The silence stretched out agonizingly. We obviously could not answer the radio. If I tried to mimic the guard's voice, they would know instantly. If we said nothing, they would know something was critically wrong. We were trapped in a terrifying waiting game. 10 seconds passed, then 20 seconds. Finally, the radio crackled for a third time. The voice of the dispatcher was no longer just asking for a check-in. He was issuing a tactical command. Alpha Team Leader is unresponsive on the executive floor. All available units converge on floor 50 immediately. Lock down the elevators and secure the stairwells. We have a potential breach, code red. I repeat, code red. Backup teams are moving now. ETA is exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes. We had exactly 240 seconds before this entire floor swarmed with heavily armed corporate mercenaries who had standing orders to shoot to kill. I looked at Walter. Sweat was pouring down his forehead in heavy drops. His hands were flying across his small keyboard, trying to force the algorithm to run faster. The digital progress bar on his small screen was only at 60%. I walked over to him and put my heavy hand on his trembling shoulder. I told him he needed to finish it right now. Walter shook his head desperately, telling me the encryption was incredibly dense and he could not make the computer process the codes any faster without frying the entire system and locking the vault permanently. He told me if he rushed it, we would lose the black ledger and the fake DNA reports forever. We would lose our absolute only chance to save Samuel and clear my name. I turned away from the safe and looked toward the heavy mahogany doors of the office. Beyond those doors, I could already hear the faint, distant ding of an elevator arriving at the end of the long hallway. I could hear the heavy thud of tactical combat boots hitting the plush carpet. They were coming for us. I reached down to the floor, picked up the heavy steel wrench I had dropped during the fight, and gripped it tightly in my bleeding hand. I told Walter to keep his eyes fixed on the screen and do not stop typing no matter what he heard outside. I walked slowly toward the office doors, ready to face whatever came through them, ready to give my life to buy my brother the time he needed. I thought about everything that brought me to this exact moment. I thought about the lonely decades I spent believing my brother was dead, mourning a man who was actually locked in a padded room just hours away, suffering in chemical darkness. I thought about my mother Evelyn, sitting downstairs, smiling and accepting false sympathy from high society elites while she built an empire on blood and lies. I thought about Claire selling her husband's soul for $50 million in real estate shares without shedding a single genuine tear. All of that unbridled greed, all of that pure calculated evil was about to come crashing down into dust if Walter could just finish his work. The pain in my cracked ribs flared with every single breath, but I welcomed it. The pain kept me focused and grounded. The pain kept me angry. It reminded me that I was still alive and still fighting for justice. I stood by the heavy oak doors of the executive office, gripping the steel wrench so tightly my calloused knuckles turned entirely white. I listened closely to the sounds in the hallway. I could hear the armed mercenaries calling out clear tactical commands to each other. They were moving down the corridor, methodically checking the side rooms. They found their unconscious team leader in the lobby. I heard one of them shout that the chief was down and the glass partition was shattered. The heavy footsteps accelerated dramatically. They were running straight toward Evelyn's private office. I glanced back at Walter. The glow from his small digital screen reflected brightly off his thick gray glasses. His face was soaked in desperate, panicked sweat. The progress bar inched forward agonizingly slow. 80%. 85%. "Come on, Walter," I whispered under my breath, my heart hammering relentlessly against my bruised chest. "You can do this. You have waited 15 long years for this exact revenge. Do not let her win today." Walter gritted his teeth and typed another rapid sequence of commands into his bypass drive. He told me the biometric firewall was actively fighting back, changing the encryption keys every 5 seconds. He had to manually trap the code and force the fake fingerprint sequence through the system layer by layer. The heavy footsteps outside stopped right in front of the mahogany doors. I held my breath. I positioned my body just to the side of the door frame, raising the heavy steel wrench high above my shoulder. I was ready to bring it down on the very first man who walked through that entrance. I was a 62-year-old retired logistics manager. I was tired. I was bleeding. I was hurting in places I did not know existed. But I was fighting for my family. And a father or a brother fighting for his family has a strength that no paid mercenary could ever possibly understand. The heavy brass doorknob began to turn slowly. The lock clicked loudly in the silence. The doors started to push open. I tightened my grip on the wrench, ready to unleash absolutely everything I had left in my soul. I stared at the widening gap, waiting for the black tactical uniform to appear, waiting for the final violent confrontation that would decide all our fates once and for all. The heavy steel door of the biometric safe finally gave way with a deep hollow click that echoed through my mother's massive executive office. Walter let out a long, ragged breath and slumped back onto the thick Persian rug, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his dark forehead. My 62-year-old ribs throbbed with every single breath I took, but I forced myself to stand tall and walk over to the open vault. Inside that reinforced steel box sitting in the dark was the holy grail of our salvation. I reached my calloused hands inside and pulled out a heavy black leather ledger. It felt incredibly dense in my hands. This was the physical book Walter had told us about. I opened the thick cover and stared at pages upon pages of handwritten entries. It contained every single dirty secret Evelyn had tried to bury. There were endless lists of offshore bank accounts routed through shell companies. There were columns of massive bribes paid to city officials, local judges, and county coroners. It was the absolute undeniable blueprint of a corrupt billionaire empire built entirely on blood and deception. Right beneath the ledger, I found a thick manila folder tied with a string. I opened it and my stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. These were the original faked DNA reports from 12 years ago. I saw the official seal of the county medical examiner pressed into the paper. I saw the forged signature verifying that the burned remains found in that crashed car belonged to my brother Samuel. They had bought a nameless body from the city morgue and burned it to ash just to create this single piece of paper. This piece of paper was the key that unlocked Samuel's $50 million real estate trust and handed it directly to his widow Claire. I held the reports tightly in my hand, feeling a deep, burning rage spread through my chest. My mother had thrown her own son into a chemical prison to rot in the dark just so she could wash her dirty money. She was a monster, and this folder was the silver bullet we needed to put her away for the rest of her natural life. But there was one more thing inside the vault. Sitting on the cold steel shelf next to where the ledger had been was a small rectangular local server drive. It looked completely out of place next to the stacks of physical paper. Walter stood up from the floor, pushing his thick gray glasses up his nose. He took the small drive from my hand and plugged it directly into the side of his heavy-duty laptop. He typed a rapid sequence of commands to bypass the encrypted file system. The screen went dark for a second before a video media player suddenly popped up. Walter clicked on the most recent file dated just 3 days ago. As the video started to play, Walter let out a sharp, terrified gasp. He backed away from the screen, completely horrified. I stepped closer to the laptop and looked at the footage. What I saw on that screen chilled my blood completely solid. It was an internal security video recorded right here in this very office. The camera angle looked down from the ceiling directly onto Evelyn's large custom mahogany desk. Sitting in the expensive leather chairs were my mother Evelyn and my sister-in-law Claire. They were drinking expensive wine and laughing. The sweet grieving widow who had wept so convincingly in the back room of that dirty diner was completely gone. Her face was relaxed and her eyes were cold and calculating. She looked exactly like Evelyn. They were sitting there discussing the problem of Samuel and me. I turned up the volume on the laptop and listened to their conversation. Every word they spoke felt like a rusty knife twisting deep into my already broken ribs. Evelyn took a sip of her wine and told Claire that the situation had escalated. She said that Harrison had managed to break Samuel out of the hospice facility and that we were currently hiding somewhere in the city. Claire did not look shocked or upset. She simply sighed and asked Evelyn how they were going to fix the mess. Evelyn leaned forward and laid out a plan so incredibly evil that my mind could barely comprehend it. She told Claire they needed to permanently dispose of Samuel. She used those exact words. Permanently dispose. She said they could not risk him ever testifying to a federal judge about the money laundering or the fake funeral. But Evelyn was smart. She knew a second mysterious death would look highly suspicious to the authorities. So she had already crafted the perfect narrative to protect them both. Evelyn told Claire they were going to frame me for Samuel's murder. She outlined the entire sick story they were going to feed to the police and the media. They were going to say that I had suffered a massive psychotic break due to overwhelming grief. They would claim that my mind was completely shattered and that I had abducted a random homeless man believing he was my dead brother. Evelyn said that when her private security team finally tracked us down, they would plant a weapon on me and stage a violent confrontation. They would shoot Samuel and they would shoot me. Then they would tell the police that the deranged kidnapper had killed the poor homeless man before the security team could stop him. Evelyn smiled as she explained how perfect it was. Claire smiled back and agreed. Claire actually raised her glass and toasted to the idea of murdering her husband and framing her brother-in-law just to protect her stolen $50 million. I stood there in the quiet office staring at the paused video on the laptop screen. My breath hitched in my throat. I had spent my entire life working hard, doing honest labor, managing freight operations, and trying to be a good man. I loved my family. I spent 12 years mourning a brother I thought was dead, only to find out he was being tortured by our own mother. And now I was watching his wife, the woman he loved, the woman he thought was coming to save him, casually planning his execution over a glass of wine. The absolute sheer scale of their betrayal was staggering. They did not see us as human beings. We were just loose ends. We were just obstacles in the way of their billionaire lifestyle. I thought about Samuel shivering in the back of that cold delivery van, waiting for me to bring him the truth. This truth was going to completely break his heart, but it was also going to set him free. Suddenly, the heavy silence of the executive office was shattered by a deafening high-pitched wail. Red strobe lights began flashing violently in the hallway outside the mahogany doors. The building-wide security alarms were blaring. The sound was incredibly loud, echoing off the thick glass windows and the polished floors. The backup guard patrol must have finally arrived on the 50th floor. They must have found their unconscious security chief lying in the shattered glass of the lobby. The entire corporate fortress was now going into full tactical lockdown mode. The radio in my black apron pocket started screaming with frantic voices. Guards were shouting orders, locking down the elevators, sealing the perimeter, and calling for immediate armed reinforcements to the executive suite. We were completely out of time. Walter panicked and started looking around wildly. I grabbed him by the shoulder and told him to calm down. I told him we had what we came for and it was time to move. Walter quickly ejected the hard drive from his laptop and shoved it deep into his pocket. I grabbed the heavy black ledger and the manila folder containing the fake DNA reports and stuffed them securely into the hidden compartment of the catering cart. But there was no way we could push that bulky cart out of here now. I ripped the documents back out and shoved them directly down the front of my shirt, pulling my black apron tight over them to hold them in place. I told Walter to leave the laptop and the cart behind. We only needed the paper and the digital drive. That was our entire legal shield. That was the only thing that could keep us out of federal prison and put Evelyn behind bars. We bolted out of the executive office and sprinted down the plush carpeted hallway. The red emergency lights flashed rhythmically, bathing the corridor in a harsh, bloody glow. I could hear the heavy combat boots of the security team running toward us from the main elevator lobby. They were shouting commands, their voices echoing loudly. We turned hard to the right and pushed through the heavy metal doors of the emergency stairwell just as the first armed guards rounded the corner. The stairwell doors slammed shut behind us, cutting off their shouts. The air inside the concrete stairwell was cold and stale. We had to go down 50 flights of stairs, 50 floors of solid concrete and steel. We started running down the stairs, taking them two at a time. My 62-year-old knees protested instantly, sending sharp shooting pains up my legs. The cracked ribs on my right side burned like a hot iron every time my boots hit the concrete steps. I had to grip the metal handrail tightly just to keep myself from stumbling and falling headfirst down the shaft. Walter was right behind me, panting heavily, his thick glasses slipping down his sweaty nose. He was not a young man either, and he had spent the last 15 years living a hard, broken life in the shadows. But fear is a powerful motivator. We ran down floor after floor, spinning around the tight concrete landings. 40 floors left, 30 floors left. The sound of the blaring alarms seemed to echo endlessly, bouncing off the hard walls and drilling into my skull. Somewhere far above us, I heard the heavy stairwell doors crash open. The security team was in the stairwell. They were coming down fast. Their heavy boots thundered against the concrete like a military drumbeat. They were younger, faster, and highly trained, and they had strict orders to eliminate the threat. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the absolute agony radiating through my chest. 20 floors left. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Every breath was a violent struggle. I could taste blood and copper in my mouth. Walter stumbled on a step and fell hard against the metal railing, dropping to his knees. I grabbed him by the collar of his white uniform and hauled him back to his feet. I told him we were not dying in this dark concrete box. I told him to keep moving. As we passed the 15th floor, a new sound joined the chaotic noise of the blaring alarms and the thundering boots. From the city streets far below, we could hear the rising wail of police sirens. Multiple sirens approaching rapidly from every direction. Evelyn's security team must have called the local police department and reported a violent breach at the corporate headquarters. The city police were rushing to surround the building. We were caught in a massive vice. The armed mercenaries were coming down from above, and the city police were swarming the ground level below. We had to get out before they completely sealed the perimeter. 10 floors left, 5 floors. We finally reached the ground floor landing. My legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. Walter collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, holding his chest. I peered through the small, reinforced wire glass window of the exit door. The door led out to the narrow back alley, completely separate from the main loading dock where we had entered. The alley was dark and filled with dumpsters. I could see the flashing blue and red lights of police cruisers reflecting off the wet brick walls at the far end of the street, but the alley itself was temporarily empty. I pushed the heavy metal bar and the door swung open into the freezing rain. We burst out into the cold, wet night air. The heavy downpour instantly soaked right through our white catering uniforms. I looked frantically down the alley, praying that Ray had followed my instructions. Out of the dark shadows, the battered white delivery van suddenly pulled forward, its headlights completely off. Ray steered the van smoothly through the narrow space and stopped right in front of us. He threw the side sliding door open. I grabbed Walter by the belt and literally threw him into the back of the van before climbing in right behind him. I slammed the heavy sliding door shut as the sound of the stairwell doors crashing open echoed behind us. Ray slammed his foot on the gas pedal and the van fishtailed wildly on the wet pavement, tearing down the alley and away from the armed guards rushing out into the rain. I collapsed onto the metal floor of the van, gasping for air. The pain in my ribs was absolutely blinding. I reached into my soaked shirt and pulled out the heavy black ledger and the fake DNA reports. They were slightly damp, but completely intact. Walter pulled the small hard drive from his pocket and held it up, his hands shaking uncontrollably. We had it. We had the Holy Grail. We had the undeniable proof of Evelyn's billionaire criminal empire. Samuel was sitting in the corner of the van, huddled under his blanket. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, asking if we got what we needed. I looked at my brother, the man who had suffered 12 years of chemical torture because of his own wife's greed. I nodded slowly. I told him we got everything. Ray was gripping the steering wheel tight, driving us through the rain, slicked back streets, avoiding the main avenues where the police sirens were wailing. He called out over his shoulder, his voice full of panic. He asked me which highway we were taking. He wanted to know if we were heading for the state line, trying to cross into Indiana or Wisconsin to hide from the massive manhunt. I sat up slowly, leaning my aching back against the metal wall of the van. I looked at the black ledger in my lap. I thought about the security video of Claire and Evelyn casually planning to murder Samuel and frame me for the crime. I thought about the 500 wealthy politicians and investors standing in the grand ballroom right now, drinking expensive champagne and writing massive donation checks to a fake charity built on my brother's suffering. I told Ray we were not going to the highway. I told him we were not fleeing the city. I looked at Samuel and Walter. We had spent our entire lives being pushed around by people with money and power. We had spent our lives hiding in the shadows, terrified of what they could do to us. But right now, in the back of this dirty delivery van, we held the absolute power to destroy them. We held the truth. I told Ray to turn the van around. I gave him a direct order. I told Ray to drive us straight back to the corporate headquarters. I told him to pull right up to the main loading dock of the grand ballroom where the gala was currently taking place. Evelyn and Claire were standing on a glowing stage right now, smiling for the cameras, lying to the world, and stealing more money in Samuel's name. They thought they had won. They thought their armed guards would quietly dispose of us in the stairwell. They had no idea that the invisible working men they despised so much were about to walk right back through their front doors. I clutched the black ledger tightly in my calloused hands. It was time to stop running. It was time to crash the party and burn their entire empire straight to the ground. Let them see the dead man walk. Let them face the truth. Let it all end tonight. The heavy delivery van idled in the dark alleyway behind the grand ballroom. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm against the metal roof. I looked at the men sitting in the back with me. We were soaked to the bone, shivering and bruised. I could feel the sharp, stabbing pain in my ribs with every breath I took. But my mind had never been clearer. We had the black ledger. We had the forged DNA reports. We had the digital hard drive containing the undeniable proof of my mother's absolute evil. Now it was time to use it. I looked at Samuel. My little brother was wrapped in a moving blanket, his face pale and sunken from 12 years of chemical torture. But the dead look in his eyes was gone. The fog had lifted. He knew exactly what his wife and his mother had done to him. He was ready to take his life back. I told Ray to keep the engine running. I grabbed the heavy leather ledger and tucked it securely under my arm. I told Walter to grab his laptop. We stepped out into the freezing rain and walked up to the loading dock doors. Because of the massive scale of the charity gala, the rear service doors were propped wide open. Catering staff and event planners were running back and forth in a total panic, carrying trays of expensive food and boxes of champagne. No one paid any attention to a 62-year-old black man in a muddy catering uniform. We slipped right through the chaos and made our way into the employee locker rooms. I broke the lock off a manager's closet and found exactly what we needed: a clean, sharp black suit. It was a little loose on Samuel's emaciated frame, but it gave him back his dignity. He put on the white shirt and buttoned the jacket. He looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. He touched his gray hair and his hollow cheeks. He was mourning the years that had been stolen from him. I put my heavy, calloused hand on his shoulder and told him it was time to show the world the truth. We left Samuel hiding in the shadows of the ground floor hallway and made our way up a narrow maintenance staircase. Walter had the building blueprints committed to memory. He led me straight to the audio and visual control booth situated on the second-floor balcony. It was a dark, soundproof room with a massive glass window that looked directly down over the grand ballroom. The door was locked, but I used my heavy steel wrench to shatter the handle. We slipped inside and locked the door behind us. I walked up to the glass window and looked down at the spectacle below. It made my stomach turn in absolute disgust. The ballroom was completely breathtaking. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the room. Tables covered in crisp white linen and expensive floral arrangements filled the floor. Over 500 of the wealthiest, most powerful people in Chicago were sitting down there. There were politicians, judges, corporate executives, and high society elites. They were all wearing custom tuxedos and sparkling designer gowns. They were eating catered meals and drinking vintage wine. And they were doing it all under a massive banner that read, "The Samuel Memorial Foundation." My mother Evelyn was sitting at the head table, completely surrounded by powerful people. She was dressed in a stunning black evening gown wearing diamonds that cost more than a working man makes in a lifetime. Right beside her sat my sister-in-law, Claire. Claire was wearing a modest, dark dress playing the role of the tragic, grieving widow to absolute perfection. She kept dabbing her eyes with a silk handkerchief, accepting hugs and comforting pats on the arm from the billionaires around her. I felt a surge of pure, burning rage hot enough to melt steel. These two women had locked my brother in a psychiatric nightmare. They had fed him mind-altering drugs for over a decade. They had stolen his $50 million real estate trust to fund their corrupt empire. And now they were sitting down there soaking up sympathy and washing more dirty money in his name. Walter opened his laptop and plugged a thick black cable directly into the main server rack of the control booth. He adjusted his thick gray glasses and his fingers began to fly across the keyboard. He told me he was bypassing the local technician controls and taking absolute command of the entire audio-visual system. He was syncing the hard drive we stole from Evelyn's vault directly into the main projector feeds and the ballroom speaker system. He looked at me with a sharp smile on his tired face and said he was ready on my command. I looked down through the glass. The lights in the ballroom began to dim. The low murmur of the wealthy crowd faded into respectful silence. Evelyn slowly walked up the steps to the main stage. She stood behind a clear acrylic podium adjusting the microphone. The spotlight hit her face, illuminating her sorrowful expression. It was the performance of a lifetime. She looked out at the sea of wealthy donors and began to speak. Her voice echoed clearly through the massive speakers filling every corner of the room. She thanked everyone for coming to honor the memory of her beloved son, Samuel. She talked about how much light he brought into the world. She talked about how his tragic death in that fiery car crash 12 years ago had completely shattered her heart. She actually let a single tear roll down her cheek. She said that out of that terrible darkness, she and Claire had built this charitable foundation to carry on his legacy. She told the crowd that their generous donations tonight would help heal the world in Samuel's name. I gripped the edge of the soundproof window so hard my knuckles turned white. My cracked ribs throbbed, but I did not care. I watched the politicians and the investors nodding in sympathy, wiping their own tears. They had no idea they were funding a massive money laundering operation. They had no idea the grieving mother on stage was a cold-blooded monster. Evelyn took a dramatic pause and looked over at Claire. Claire stood up from her table and gave a brave, trembling smile to the crowd. The audience broke into a gentle, supportive applause. Evelyn turned back to the microphone and asked the guests to direct their attention to the giant projector screens hanging above the stage. She said they had prepared a beautiful memorial slideshow to celebrate Samuel's life before they began the pledge drive. I looked at Walter and gave him a single sharp nod. Walter hit the execute key on his laptop. Down in the ballroom, the giant projector screens flickered brightly for a fraction of a second. But the pictures of Samuel playing college basketball did not appear. The soft, emotional background music did not play. Instead, the screens filled with the crisp, high-definition security footage we had stolen from Evelyn's vault. It was the video from just 3 days ago. The video showing Evelyn and Claire sitting in the private executive office upstairs. The audio kicked in, blasting through the state-of-the-art sound system with crystal-clear perfection. Every single person in that massive ballroom heard Evelyn's cold, calculating voice echo off the walls. The voice on the speakers did not sound like a grieving mother. It sounded like a ruthless criminal. The entire ballroom heard Evelyn say that Harrison had broken Samuel out of the hospice facility. They heard Evelyn explicitly state that they needed to permanently dispose of Samuel before he could testify about the money laundering. The 500 guests sitting at the tables froze in absolute shock. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. The silence in the crowd was suffocating. People stared up at the giant screens, their mouths hanging open in horror. Then the audio of Claire echoed through the ballroom. The sweet, grieving widow who had just smiled so bravely for the crowd was now on the screen holding a glass of expensive wine. The entire room watched as Claire agreed to the murder plot. They watched as Claire coldly discussed how they were going to frame me for Samuel's death to protect her stolen $50 million. They watched as the two women toasted their wine glasses to the idea of executing a man they claimed to love. Absolute total chaos erupted in the ballroom. Politicians dropped their drinks. Wealthy investors stood up from their chairs, shouting in confusion and anger. The illusion was completely shattered. Evelyn stood at the podium looking up at the giant screens in sheer frozen panic. All the color instantly drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. She started screaming at the event staff to cut the power to turn off the screens to do something. but Walter had completely locked them out of the system. The video kept playing, looping the damning conversation over and over again, the undeniable proof of their crimes washing over the crowd. Claire was standing by the head table, trembling violently. She dropped her silk handkerchief and backed away from the screen, her hands covering her mouth. The wealthy elites sitting next to her quickly pulled away, looking at her with absolute disgust and terror. The murmurs of the crowd turned into a loud, roaring uproar. People were pulling out their cell phones, recording the giant screens, calling their lawyers, calling the authorities. Evelyn's private security guards were running frantically around the edges of the room, trying to find the source of the broadcast, but they were completely powerless to stop it. I watched from the dark control booth, feeling a deep, powerful sense of justice wash over my tired soul. I did not need to use my fists to destroy them. I did not need a weapon. I just used the truth. I let their own arrogant words dig their graves. Walter looked at me, his eyes shining with tears of vindication. He had finally cleared his name. He had finally exposed the woman who ruined his life 15 years ago. I patted his shoulder and told him he did a good job. But the night was not over yet. There was one final piece to this reckoning. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket and sent a single text message to Ray, who was waiting down in the alley. The message simply said now. Down in the ballroom, the security video finally stopped playing. The giant screens went completely black. The roaring crowd slowly fell into a tense, heavy silence, waiting to see what would happen next. Every eye in the room was fixed on the stage where Evelyn stood, gripping the acrylic podium so hard her hands shook. She was trapped. She had nowhere left to run. Then the heavy grand mahogany doors at the very back of the ballroom slowly began to swing open. The bright lights from the main hallway spilled into the darkened room, casting a long, dramatic shadow down the center aisle. The entire crowd turned their heads to look. Standing in the doorway was Samuel. He was thin and his hair was prematurely gray from a decade of chemical abuse, but he was wearing a clean, sharp suit. He stood tall, and his eyes were clear and completely focused. The dead son, the buried husband, the man whose memory they were exploiting to steal millions of dollars, was standing right in front of them, breathing and alive. A collective gasp swept through the 500 guests. Women covered their mouths in shock. Men stepped back, pulling their wives away from the aisle. The crowd literally parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, clear path right down the middle of the ballroom. Samuel began to walk. He did not rush. He put one foot in front of the other, walking with a slow, steady, powerful grace. He looked straight ahead, keeping his eyes locked entirely on the stage. He walked past the local politicians who had attended his fake funeral. He walked past the corporate investors who had written checks to his fake charities. He walked past the people who had forgotten him completely. He was a dead man returning from the grave to reclaim his stolen life. I watched my little brother walk down that aisle, and I felt a tear slide down my bruised cheek. I was so incredibly proud of him. He was facing the monsters who broke him, and he was doing it with absolute fearless dignity. Samuel reached the front of the stage and stopped. He looked up at Evelyn. Evelyn took a trembling step backward. Her knees gave out and she collapsed against the acrylic podium. The microphone slipped from her hands and crashed onto the hardwood stage with a loud, piercing screech that echoed through the silent room. She stared at her resurrected son, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her own destruction. There were no more lies she could spin. There were no more bribes she could pay. The truth was standing right in front of her. Samuel slowly turned his head and looked at Claire. The woman who had promised to love him until death parted them. The woman who had sold him to a chemical prison for $50 million. Claire let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure terror. Her legs buckled entirely and she fell hard to her knees on the ballroom floor. She scrambled backward away from Samuel, weeping hysterically, begging for forgiveness she knew she would never receive. She was completely broken. I stood in the high window of the control booth, holding the heavy black ledger against my chest. My cracked ribs still burned, my face was bruised, and my hands were bleeding. But as I looked down at the shattered empire of Evelyn and Claire, I finally felt the heavy weight of the last 12 years lift entirely from my shoulders. The hunt was over. The truth was out. The invisible working men had finally won. Justice had been served. I stood up in that dark control booth and pressed my hands against the thick, soundproof glass window. Down below in the grand ballroom, the silence was so incredibly heavy, it felt like it could physically crush the breath right out of your lungs. Hundreds of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the city of Chicago were frozen completely solid in their expensive seats. They were staring at a ghost. My brother Samuel stood in the center aisle of that massive room. His face was gaunt, and his hair was prematurely gray from a decade of severe chemical torture, but he stood with his head held high. He looked directly at the brightly lit stage where our mother Evelyn was gripping the acrylic podium in absolute terror. For a few long, agonizing seconds, nobody moved a single muscle. The sheer, shocking reality of a dead man walking into his own memorial fundraiser had paralyzed the entire room. But Evelyn did not become a billionaire by surrendering easily. She was a ruthless survivor who knew how to manipulate every situation. I watched the raw terror in her eyes shift into a cold, desperate fury. She realized she was losing control of the narrative she had carefully crafted for over a decade. She realized the $50 million she had stolen was slipping right through her perfectly manicured fingers. She did not grab the microphone to explain herself to the crowd. She did not try to apologize to the son she had buried in a psychiatric nightmare. Instead, she raised her trembling hand and pointed a sharp manicured finger straight at Samuel. She looked at the private mercenaries standing around the perimeter of the room, and she gave them a silent, deadly command to attack. The spell broke instantly. 6 of Evelyn's highly paid corporate security guards snapped out of their shock. They wore tailored black suits, but they moved like the brutal street thugs they truly were. They started pushing through the crowd of politicians and investors, shoving wealthy socialites out of the way to get to my brother. They reached under their jackets for their concealed weapons. They were going to grab Samuel, drag him out of the ballroom, and silence him before he could speak a single word to the authorities. They were going to finish the job they started 12 years ago, and they did not care who saw them do it. I felt a massive surge of panic grip my chest. My cracked ribs screamed in pure physical agony, but I gripped the heavy steel wrench in my calloused hand. I was ready to smash the control booth window and jump down into the ballroom. I was ready to break my own legs to protect my little brother from those monsters. But before I could even take a single step forward, Walter grabbed my shoulder. His hand was shaking, but he had a wide, proud smile on his exhausted face. He looked at me through his thick gray glasses and told me to just wait and watch. He told me I did not need my fists anymore because the trap had already been set. I looked back down through the glass window just as the first massive security guard lunged toward Samuel. The guard reached his thick hands out to grab my brother's shoulder, but his hands never made contact. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom completely exploded open. They did not just swing open. They were kicked open with a violent, terrifying force that echoed over the chaotic murmurs of the elite crowd. A massive flood of men and women in dark windbreakers poured into the room. They were not local police. They were not the corrupt city cops on Evelyn's payroll who had been hunting us all week. They were federal agents. They wore dark tactical vests with bright yellow letters printed boldly across their chests. They moved with absolute military precision and undeniable authority. They swarmed the ballroom floor, shouting commands that cut through the noise of the high society crowd. They ordered everyone to stay exactly where they were and keep their hands visible. I looked at Walter in absolute disbelief. He adjusted his glasses and gave a low, tired chuckle. He explained that he had not just been building a bypass drive in that damp basement for the last 2 days. Walter had been an elite forensic accountant 15 years ago, before Evelyn framed him and ruined his life. He still knew people in the high levels of the federal justice system. He still had trusted contacts who remembered his brilliance and his uncompromising integrity. When we first formed our plan, Walter had reached out to a trusted federal prosecutor. He had given them enough breadcrumbs about Evelyn's money laundering and fake charities to secure a quiet federal investigation. And when we plugged that hard drive into his laptop just minutes ago, Walter did not just broadcast the security video to the projector screens. He had simultaneously transmitted the entire contents of the Black Ledger and the unedited video files directly to the federal task force. The agents had been staging outside the building in the rain, waiting for the final piece of undeniable digital evidence to drop. The federal agents moved through the ballroom like an unstoppable tidal wave. They completely bypassed the terrified billionaires and politicians who were cowering by their tables. They went straight for Evelyn's private security team. The mercenaries who had been so eager to grab Samuel suddenly found themselves completely surrounded by federal tactical shotguns. The guards threw their hands up in the air, instantly surrendering. They were brutal thugs who liked to beat up old working men, but they were not going to fight a heavily armed federal task force. They dropped their weapons and let the agents push them face down onto the expensive carpet, securing their wrists with zip ties. Down on the stage, Evelyn watched her private army get neutralized in a matter of seconds. The impenetrable shield of wealth and power she had spent decades building was dissolving right before her eyes, but she refused to accept reality. She still believed she was entirely untouchable. I watched her stand up straight and smooth down the front of her expensive black evening gown. She lifted her chin, trying to summon every ounce of aristocratic dignity she possessed. She thought she could buy her way out of this. She thought she could talk her way out of federal custody, just like she talked her way out of every other mess in her corrupt life. 3 federal agents marched heavily up the steps of the stage. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Evelyn held up her hand and gave him a look of absolute wealthy disdain. Her voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. She demanded to call her corporate attorneys immediately. She told the agents they were making a catastrophic mistake. She threatened to ruin their careers, to sue the federal government to have their badges revoked by morning. She spoke with the unbelievable arrogance of a woman who truly believed she owned the world. The lead agent did not say a single word. He did not care about her money. He did not care about her political connections. He stepped forward, grabbed her right arm, and twisted it forcefully behind her back. Evelyn let out a sharp gasp of shock as her pristine image was completely shattered in front of her peers. The agent slammed her face first against the clear acrylic podium, the very same podium where she had just stood shedding fake tears and begging for donations in her dead son's name. The impact rattled the microphone stand loudly. The entire ballroom watched as the billionaire matriarch of the family was treated exactly like a common street criminal. The agent snapped the heavy steel cuffs onto her wrists, pulling them tight. He leaned in and read her rights, his voice echoing through the silent room, detailing charges of grand theft fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Evelyn struggled against his grip, her perfect hair falling into her face, her expensive diamonds flashing under the bright stage lights, but she was completely powerless. Her empire was officially dead. While Evelyn was being pinned to the podium, my sister-in-law Claire was completely unraveling on the ballroom floor. Claire had always been soft, always playing the victim. She used her tears as a weapon to manipulate everyone around her. Now that the undeniable truth was fully exposed, she reverted to her oldest trick. She looked at Samuel standing tall and quiet in the center aisle. She realized her $50 million real estate fortune was gone. She realized she was facing decades in a federal penitentiary for helping Evelyn fake a death and lock a man in a chemical cage. Claire scrambled across the hardwood floor on her hands and knees. She crawled toward Samuel, sobbing hysterically, her face twisted in fake agony. Her modest dark dress dragged across the ground. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of Samuel's sharp, clean suit. She buried her tear-stained face against his legs and began to beg. It was the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever seen in my 62 years of life. She wailed loudly, claiming she had no choice. She swore to Samuel that Evelyn had forced her to do it. She lied through her teeth, telling him she loved him and that she wanted to save him but was too afraid of his powerful mother. She begged for his forgiveness, pleading with him to tell the federal agents that she was just an innocent victim caught in the crossfire. I watched Samuel look down at the woman he had promised to cherish for the rest of his life. For 12 years he had sat in a dark, padded room, heavily drugged and alone, praying for her to come and rescue him. He had believed in her love. He had trusted her completely. And she had traded all of that trust for a bank account and a high society title. Samuel did not yell. He did not curse her. He did not raise his hand in anger. He looked at her with eyes that had seen the deepest parts of hell and survived to tell the tale. His face was a mask of cold, absolute finality. Samuel gently but firmly reached down and peeled Claire's trembling hands off his suit. He stepped back, breaking all physical contact with her forever. He looked down at her crawling on the floor, and he simply shook his head. He did not say a single word. He did not have to. His silence was louder and more devastating than any scream. He turned his back on her and coldly stepped right over her weeping body. He walked away, leaving her sobbing alone on the floor as two female federal agents grabbed her by the arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. They snapped handcuffs onto Claire's wrists, completely ignoring her frantic pleading. The agents dragged Evelyn and Claire down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd of wealthy donors parted to let them through, staring in absolute silent horror. The socialites and politicians who had just been hugging Claire and praising Evelyn now turned their backs on them. They pulled out their phones, deleting contact numbers and distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. Evelyn and Claire were paraded out of the grand double doors and pushed into the flashing lights of the local news cameras, waiting out in the freezing rain. Their faces were broadcast across the entire country, not as grieving family members, but as the ruthless monsters they truly were. Within the hour, federal judges would freeze every single one of their bank accounts. The government would seize the corporate headquarters, the mansions, the offshore shell companies, and the $50 million trust fund. Their reputations were instantly completely destroyed, and their freedom was revoked forever. They were going to spend the rest of their natural lives rotting in a small concrete cell, trading their tailored suits for bright orange jumpsuits. I left the control booth and walked slowly down the stairs to the ballroom floor. My ribs ached with a deep burning pain, but I walked with my head held high. I carried the heavy, physical black ledger under my arm, holding it like a shield. I walked down the center aisle, past the stunned billionaires and the whispering politicians. I did not belong in their world, and I never wanted to. I was a working man, a man who built his life on sweat and honesty. I walked straight up to my brother. Samuel turned and looked at me. The deep exhaustion in his face was still there, but the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 12 years was finally gone. We did not need to speak. We had survived the ultimate betrayal. We had fought against impossible odds, and we had torn a billionaire empire down to its very foundation, using nothing but the brutal, undeniable truth. I wrapped my heavy, calloused arms around my little brother, pulling him into a tight embrace. He hugged me back, resting his chin on my shoulder. We stood there in the middle of that glittering, chaotic ballroom, two old broken men who had finally found their way back to the light. The federal agents approached us respectfully, asking us to come downtown to give our official statements and hand over the physical ledger. We nodded and walked out of the ballroom together side by side. We walked out into the cold Chicago rain, breathing in the fresh, clean air of absolute freedom. The nightmare was finally over. The invisible men had won. If you connected with my story, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this old working man's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me and what time of day it is for you. 6 months have passed since that night in the grand ballroom. Half a year since the truth finally shattered the walls of my mother's billionaire empire. Time moves differently when you are no longer looking over your shoulder, when you spend your entire life waiting for the next disaster to strike you. Forget how to simply sit still and breathe. But today, I am breathing just fine. The heavy dust has finally settled over the city of Chicago, and the storm that nearly drowned my family is completely gone. The federal justice system moves slowly, but when it has a recorded confession and a physical ledger of bribes, it moves with absolute crushing certainty. Evelyn and Claire did not get to go home that night. They did not get to post bail and sleep in their silk sheets. The federal judge looked at the mountain of evidence Walter had gathered and declared them both extreme flight risks. Their passports were seized. Their bank accounts were frozen solid. For the first time in her entire life, my mother could not buy her way out of a room. She stood in that federal courtroom wearing a standard orange jumpsuit stripped of her expensive diamonds and her high society arrogance. She looked small. She looked exactly like the hollow, greedy shell of a human being she had always been on the inside. The prosecution charged them with wire fraud, money laundering, grand theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. They are both facing decades in a federal penitentiary. They will never breathe free air again. Claire tried to play the victim right up until the very end. She cried in the courtroom. She begged the judge for mercy, claiming she was manipulated by Evelyn. But the security video of her drinking expensive wine and casually planning the murder of her own husband completely destroyed her defense. The jury saw the cold, absolute truth. She traded the man she promised to love for $50 million in real estate shares. Now she will spend the rest of her natural life in a concrete cell regretting the day she decided money was more important than a human soul. Samuel had the hardest mountain to climb. You do not just walk out of 12 years of chemical torture and go right back to normal. And legally returning from the dead is a massive bureaucratic nightmare. But we had Walter on our side. Walter helped Samuel navigate the endless federal hearings and court filings to officially reverse his death certificate. It took months of DNA tests and sworn testimonies, but my little brother finally got his name back. He reclaimed his legal identity, and with it, he reclaimed absolute control over his $50 million stake in the family empire. Many men would have taken that massive fortune and disappeared to a private island to live out their days in luxury. But Samuel is a good man. He always possessed a deep, pure kindness that our mother tried desperately to destroy. He did not keep a single penny of that blood money. He and Walter worked day and night to completely dismantle Evelyn's corrupt corporate structure. They tracked down every offshore account and every fake foundation. Samuel took all $50 million and legally redistributed it back to the real charities and the working-class communities that Evelyn had exploited. He funded youth centers on the South Side. He built clinics for families who could not afford medical care. He took the empire of lies our mother built and turned it into a foundation of genuine hope. Watching him sign those transfer documents, watching him give all that wealth away, was the proudest moment of my entire 62 years on this earth. Now we live far away from the noise and the greed of the city. We bought a modest, quiet wooden cabin surrounded by tall pine trees right on the edge of a clear blue lake. The air here smells like fresh pine needles and cool water. There are no sirens. There are no flashing lights. There is only the sound of the wind blowing through the branches and the gentle ripple of the water hitting the shore. I am sitting on the wooden front porch right now, watching the sun slowly rise over the tree line. The golden morning light reflects off the calm surface of the lake. Samuel is sitting in a rocking chair right next to me. He's holding a simple ceramic mug of hot black coffee. He looks so much healthier now. The terrible gray pallor is completely gone from his skin. He has put some weight back on his tall frame, and the dark, heavy circles under his eyes have finally faded. The chemical fog that clouded his mind for over a decade has entirely evaporated. He looks like the brother I used to play basketball with in the driveway all those years ago. He takes a sip of his coffee and looks out at the water. A quiet, genuine smile rests on his face. It is a smile of a man who walked through the darkest valley of hell and managed to find his way back to the light. Inside the cabin, I can hear the loud, booming voices of Ray and Walter. They are sitting at the kitchen table arguing over a game of cards. Ray is no longer sleeping under bridges near the train tracks. He has a warm bed, a full stomach, and a permanent roof over his head. Walter is no longer living in a damp basement hiding from the world. His name has been completely cleared by the federal authorities. His professional record is wiped clean of Evelyn's forged lies. They are two old men bickering like lifelong brothers, slamming cards down on the wooden table and laughing loudly. We are four broken men. We all lost years of our lives to the cruelty of others. I lost my career and my peace of mind. Samuel lost his youth and his freedom. Ray lost his dignity on the cold city streets. Walter lost his pristine reputation and his family. But standing together, we found a way to heal. We took the broken pieces of our separate lives and we built a new family. I sit back in my chair and listen to the sounds of my family living and breathing around me. I spent my whole life believing that blood was the most important bond a man could have. I believed that because Evelyn was my mother, I owed her my loyalty. I believed that because Claire married my brother, she was part of our soul. I learned the hardest, most painful way possible that blood does not make someone family. Blood only makes you related. Loyalty, love, and sacrifice are what truly make a family. Evelyn gave me life, but she tried to take away everything that made life worth living. She used her own children as disposable tools to build a mountain of dirty money. She proved that a person can have all the wealth in the entire world and still be absolutely bankrupt in their soul. But through all the pain and all the terror, I found out what real wealth looks like. Real wealth is sitting on a quiet porch with the brother you thought you had lost forever. Real wealth is hearing the laughter of friends who stood by your side when the entire world was trying to hunt you down. Samuel and I gave each other our lives back. I pulled him out of that chemical prison, and he gave me the strength to finally stand up and fight. We survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and we came out the other side stronger than before. We do not need mansions or designer coats or fake high society galas. We have this cabin. We have the quiet lake. We have each other. And for a tired old freight manager from Chicago, that is more than enough. The long, grueling highway of my life has finally led me home. I am no longer running. The engine is turned off and my heart is finally at rest. If my story touched your heart today, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this old working man's soul. It means the world to me to know that our journey can help others see the truth in their own lives. Subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next life stories I will share with you. I want to build a community of strong, honest people here. Please tell me in the comments exactly where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. If you have ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, or if you have ever had to fight to protect the people you love, share your experience below. It makes this man very happy to know which city you are watching from and at what time of day you are keeping me company. Let us exchange experiences that can help other families stay strong and vigilant. I send a big hug the size of my heart to every single one of you. Did you like my story, and which city are you listening from? Let us meet down in the comments. If you appreciate the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this to the light. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to reading your comments on the story. You will see 2 new life stories on your screen soon that I highly recommend you watch next. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. I will see you in the next life story. Always live with love and respect. To anyone listening to my voice right now, I want you to hear this loud and clear and hold it deep in your spirit. Money can buy a whole lot of things in this cold world. It can buy silence when people should be screaming. It can buy power and influence to bend the rules. It can buy a corrupt doctor, a dirty politician, and a private army of men in expensive tailored suits. It can even buy a fake funeral with a closed casket to bury a man who is still breathing in a dark room. But let me tell you what all the millions and billions of dollars in this world can never buy. It can never buy the truth. You can pour thick concrete over the truth. You can lock it in a state-of-the-art biometric safe behind a massive mahogany desk. You can drug it, chain it to a bed, and hide it in a forgotten corner of the city. But the truth is a living, breathing thing. It will always claw its way out of the dirt. It might take a day, a month, or even 12 long, agonizing years. But the truth absolutely does not die. It just waits for the right working man to come along with a heavy steel wrench and a heart full of righteous anger to break it out of its cage. I sit here on this quiet porch today, looking out at the calm lake water, and I know my journey was not just for me and my brother. It was for every single person out there who has been stepped on by people with too much money and absolutely no soul. We proved that the invisible men do not have to stay invisible forever. We proved that if you stand your ground, you can bring down an entire empire of lies. If you found a little bit of strength in our story today, if you truly believe that real justice still exists for those who are willing to stand up and fight for it, then please hit that like button to support this old man's journey. It means the world to me to know that you are standing right here with us. Subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss another story of hard-earned resilience and survival. I really want to know who is out there listening to me at this very moment. Please tell me down in the comments exactly what city you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It fills my heart with pure joy to read your messages and know which corner of the world you are keeping me company from. Stay strong, my friends. Protect your real family with everything you have. Hold the people you love close to your heart and never let anyone bury the truth. I will see you in the next life story. Live with love and respect.